Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Freedom Blueprint. I'm Adrienne Green, and today you are going to get to hear my story about how I got started with virtual assistants as a real estate entrepreneur. This is something I'm really passionate about helping other real estate entrepreneurs do is use these virtual assistants within their business. So I want to show you why. I want to tell you how transformational it was for me. I first brought in virtual assistants to my real estate agent business before I brought them in onto the investing side. And it really was what led me to go from a solo agent to a team leader to then having a business that I could sell. It was transformational in the amount of income it brought in and the amount of impact I could have for people I worked with. And that's why I love helping other people get virtual assistants with my virtual staffing company, Workergenics. So I'm going to share that story from the very beginning with you today. And if you want to see and evaluate a difference this could make with your own business, I want to make sure you know to head over to my website, adriennegreen.com. I have a time and freedom starter pack there. This is a free download you can get that walks you through exactly how it could work in your business so that you can do that evaluation and figure out if it would be a good fit for you. Now let's go ahead and dive into my story of how I got started with virtual assistants. So for those of you who don't know me, I was a real estate investor since 2013. Being a real estate investor led to me becoming a real estate agent in 2018. So I was a solo agent at first for those real estate agents on the call. I was in the Northern Virginia market and I had a pretty solid business there. I was averaging about 5 million in sales volume. I did 12 transactions a year. So pretty much if I had a closing a month and I always had one under contract, like that brought me around 100 grand in income. Like that was pretty good. Now I will note, like shout out to my husband Harley. He somewhere in this time period had read the 4 Hour Work Week and was like, hey, you could use a VA to help you as a real estate agent and be this huge thing. And I did not listen. I dismissed it. I was like, no, I don't need to do that. How could that work? And then in 2020, I actually met an amazing team that was with Keller Williams, and they convinced me to go to Keller Williams to join the team. And this team used virtual assistant. This was my first time really working in a business that used virtual assistants. And I saw for myself, like, wow, this is pretty awesome. Like, this is great help. This really lightens my load as an agent and allows me to focus on what I do best. And shortly after joining that team, my husband and I did decide that we were going to relocate from Northern Virginia to Chattanooga, Tennessee. So, unfortunately, I didn't stay on that team very long. I do appreciate what they gave me. It was huge in helping me build my own business once I moved to Chattanooga because I saw how they used these virtual assistants. So that takes us to the end of 2020. And in January 2021, I am ready to start being an active agent in Chattanooga, Tennessee. I've got my licenses for Tennessee and Georgia. I am ready to roll. This was a challenging situation. So first, I was in a new market where I had no sphere, as they call it, right? Like I knew one person in Chattanooga and she was a real estate agent. So she was not going to be my client. A lot of real estate agents, they get their clients from people they know, people they went to high school with, people that are in the PTA with them. And I didn't have any of those long-standing connections. Also, I was going from an average market where the price point was around 500,000 to a market where the average price point was around 300,000. So a little more than half, meaning that if I wanted, since agents are paid on commission, if I wanted to do the same amount of business, I was going to have to do twice the work. And then the other thing that made this an extra fun challenge is that I had 3 children between the ages of 0 and 5 at that time. So I was having to start this business from scratch and without all of the things that people usually have start the business, like connections. And I was having to do that while I was also in a time of life with a lot of like personal demands. So what would you be thinking? I'm curious, like what would you be thinking? What would you be doing if you faced that situation, right? How would you set up your business to succeed? Well, I was lucky enough that I had an amazing coach who was a friend of mine, Nicole, if you're listening, shout out to Nicole. And she and I worked together. We sat down and we came up with 2 key pieces of my strategy. The first was that I was going to niche down to helping real estate investors. Real estate investors were my passion in the real estate space. They were how I got into real estate in the first place. And there was something where I could really differentiate myself from other agents because I was an experienced real estate investor. So the second piece of that strategy was that I was going to hire a virtual assistant. And that was because I was going to need to do twice the amount of deals just to make the same amount of money, not even more money. And I knew that was going to be a lot of paperwork, a lot of back end. Plus, I was going to need to work more on lead generation because I didn't have that sphere or anybody who was going to come to me, past clients. So I was going to need to free up more time to do lead generation and marketing. So that meant, again, somebody helping with all the operations, someone helping with the logistics of that marketing was going to be really transformational. Now, there's lots of reasons to hire a virtual assistant, right? The affordability piece, where they can be much more affordable than someone in person, having greater selection, because you're really like, let's say we're pulling from the Philippines, we're pulling from an entire country rather than just the city that you live in. The high education levels, right? I could afford with a virtual assistant somebody who's college educated versus locally, I would be maybe getting a college student or somebody who had no college degree. The fact that with a VA, it's very common to have multiple use employees. So having somebody who could help with operations and marketing and bookkeeping was going to be easy versus in the US, it can be a little more difficult to find. Flexibility, I can have them work whatever schedule I wanted because that is the way it works with the virtual assistant. And then one thing that was huge for me is that I didn't have to figure out like a payroll company or like how to do W-2s or 1099s and overhead because I wanted someone full time. I knew that I needed to grow the business I wanted to grow. I needed 40 hours of work a week of work, and that wasn't really going to be an independent contractor, let's be real. So I was either going to fudge on the legality or I was going to need to figure out how to do payroll and how to do all these things legally to have a full-time employee. And I didn't want to do that. Like that was a lot of paperwork and overhead. And so I loved that with virtual assistants, because they're located abroad, all of our employment laws don't apply. And I didn't have to deal with stuff like tax stuff. I didn't have to deal with tax withholding. I didn't have to deal with insurance or any of those things because they're abroad. And at the same time, I also didn't have to worry about any kind of legal liability or future lawsuits or anything because they're abroad. Again, our US laws in terms of employment don't apply. So that just made it a lot easier to make this commitment. So what did the virtual assistant do? So I hired this VA full time. It was harder because Workogenics didn't exist then. So I had to go like do it myself. And then they came in and what did I have to do? Well, I break it down what they would do into three main pieces. The first is they did 80% of my computer and phone-based tasks. 80% of what you're doing on the computer or the phone, and an executive assistant could do for you virtually. Second, if you are listening to this, you probably know the 80-20 rule, right? And like how the top 20% of our tasks make 80% of the difference. But we have all of that bottom 80% tasks that take up time and work and bandwidth. And they could do all my bottom 80% tasks. And third, they did tasks I couldn't do. Now, what breaks down into these? What does that mean? Well, with the 80% of the computer and phone tasks, they could do a lot of our contract to close tasks, right? They could handle things like contracts. They could handle things like ordering and sending a client gift, right? Things like that that weren't my top 20%. Second, they could really help with emails. So I would always have consult calls with a new client. And then after those consult calls, we would do email introductions to the people that that client needed. So like, let's say a buyer client that doesn't have a pre-approval yet, they need a lender. If they're going to keep a rental in the area, they need property managers. If they're going to do value add, they need general contractors. And so what we did is we had template emails for all of these different people that we worked with. And then I would just write, hey, here's John Doe, here's the details about John Doe. And my virtual assistant would take the details I gave about John Doe, and they would send all these template emails to all of these people, saving me a ton of time. They could also do things like, again, for a buyer client, they could set up the searches and MLS, like all of that back end stuff that happens once you make a connection with somebody who's going to be a potential client. Now, the bottom 80% tasks. One of the biggest ones of this was bookkeeping and accounting. If you're listening to this as a real estate entrepreneur, odds are your books are not up to date. They don't have the receipts attached, they're not properly categorized. So you're not able to go into QuickBooks or whatever you're using and see right now, what's my net income to date, right? And so my virtual assistant was able to do that. So my books were up to date. And we got to the point where every Friday during my time block for like business check-in and planning, I was able to go into a spreadsheet, a Google Sheet that my virtual assistant would update first thing Friday morning that had what's our debt income year to date? What are our outstanding liabilities, right? Total of the credit card. How much do we have in the bank account, right? Our assets. And how much commission do we have under contract right now? How much money are we expecting to make over the next, let's say, roughly 30 days? as we have stuff under contract. I was able to look at that every Friday and have a great financial snapshot of where we were as a real estate agent and then as a real estate agent team because the virtual assistant kept those books up to date. Same thing, as a real estate agent, you guys know in the real estate space, there's so much to do with compliance, so much paperwork, so much contract work. They were able to help rep and check and do a lot of the things on that end so that I really didn't have to spend as much time. I could just go in and double check things, not create them from scratch. And then in terms of the things that I couldn't do, they could do video editing, graphic design, and event planning. That was all stuff that we were able to really 10x because I did not even need to figure it out. So like one of the things we did with my team is we started having these real estate investor meetups. And the first one, it was like, okay, we're just going to have a brainstorm of this is what we need. We need to rent the space. We need to get the food. We need to get the speaker. We need to get the tech. We need to get the photographer, all these things, get some sponsors. And then after that, the virtual assistant was able to make an SOP, checklist, everything, so that this could become a repeatable thing we did again and again. And all I needed to do was select the day and time. So that was something really cool that they were able to do. And so with the virtual assistant doing all that, what was the effect, right? Like, did this actually make a difference in my business? It made a huge difference. So I brought on a virtual assistant in January of 2021. And by August of 2021, I had done 54 real estate transactions in a new market where I had no sphere. That was 10 million in volume. So in those 8 months, I did 5 times more transactions than I was usually doing in an entire year. And I had done twice the volume. And I was so busy that even with a full-time virtual assistant, even with some like showing agents to help with showings, I needed to start a team. And I went into like my brokerage and talked to the leadership there and said, what it needs to have to start a team? Because as an agent, I don't have enough hours in the day to service all the clients that have come. And this is in an area, again, no sphere, nothing. But it was because the virtual assistant was handling so much of that back end and I was able to do lead gen and marketing and things like YouTube. I was able to just record a YouTube video and then the virtual assistant was able to go and edit it, make the thumbnail, put the caption in, get it on YouTube, promote it on social media, and do that kind of marketing that was bringing in these clients. And I would have never had time for that if I didn't have a virtual assistant.
If you're a real estate entrepreneur trying to scale while doing everything yourself, there's a better way. The Time and Freedom Starter Pack gives you the exact first steps to reclaim hours each week with real support, including what to hand off, where to start, and simple tools you can put into place right away. Download it for free at adriennegreen.com/starter pack. Now let's get back to the episode.
So then in August of 2021, I started this real estate team. And the team had agents and then virtual assistants did all of the admin work. Most of the team lifespan of it, I had 2 years. There were about 3 virtual assistants. We had one who focused on contract to close. She worked part-time for us because she had another in-person job in the Philippines and she did contract to close. We had another person who focused on like video editing and marketing. And we then had somebody who did like general admin, everything else. And annually, we typically did about 27 million in volume and sales volume, and that was about 130 transactions. We were doing a lot of transactions. A lot of these were investment properties. We weren't like the most expensive houses in the area, but we could do this volume-based business because we had virtual assistants helping so much of that admin work. This consistently, for those of you who are in the Keller Williams world, put us in like the top 10% of the market center. I was selected for the ALC, the Agent Leadership Council, in 2023. Other thing is, those numbers are great. The business was successful. Money is good for the good it can do, right? And so having this allowed me to have time with my family. It allowed me to make sure I was going to all those little league games, to be at all the events for my daughter and everything like that. So that was really a huge part of it as well. Now, in August 2023, I was at the Keller Williams Mega Agent Camp, and these people had these great ideas. They were like, oh my goodness, this is amazing things to do in a business, a real estate business, and a team. But I was like, I'm not really like super excited to implement this myself. And I realized that it was time for me to sell the team and move on to other things. That was my time was done with the team and that got into other plans for me. So I made that decision in August of 2023 and sold the team at the end of October of 2023. So about 2.5 months total in process. And having virtual assistants on the team helped with that sale in a number of ways. The first is that using virtual assistants helped lower the costs that I had with the team because they cost less than an in-person assistant, which allowed us to have higher net income, right? Because if I'm paying like for Workergenics roughly $24,000 a year for a virtual assistant instead of, let's say, 48,000 for easy numbers, twice as much, that means that I had a net income that was $24,000 higher. Well, then when we're looking to sell that business and we're looking at, like, let's say 2 or 3x multiple, that means that now my business is worth, because I have 24,000 in more net income, my business is now worth 48 or $72,000 more because the valuation of that business is based on that net income multiple. So that was one of the things, first off, is that I was able to get more for the business because I spent less by having virtual assistants. The second thing is that when you go to sell a business, if you're going to have somebody valuing that business, a broker, somebody like this, we actually found a guy who specialized in valuing teams and brokerages. So that was cool for real estate. They're going to say, okay, when you, Mr. Owner, Mrs. Owner, like Adrienne in this case, when you leave the business, how much of that business is going to leave with you? How many deals are you closing yourself? How many of those clients are coming because they went to high school with you, right? How much of this business is related to your personal actions? And when you stop taking those actions, it's going to go out the door with you. Well, by having virtual assistants doing a lot of these actions instead of doing them myself, I could say, hey, when I walk out the door, contract to close is going to stay the same. Clients are going to get the same gifts. They're going to get the same thank you cards. They're going to get all of this because it is a system and it is a procedure that I am not personally involved in. So that was one of the huge things, is that the business was less reliant on me. And so it maintained more of its value even when I was to step away. So that was another way that having virtual assistants helped with that valuation. And so that is when I sold the team, and we now have our own online businesses, and we started traveling full time shortly after that. And, in this podcast, I was really focused on how I first got started with virtual assistants and how I use them in my real estate agent business. After I had initial success with that, I brought in virtual assistants to help with my property management, with my investing business. And we also started Workogenics because my husband and I saw how transformational it was for us and wanted other real estate entrepreneurs, other entrepreneurs in general, to be able to take advantage of this and to make it easier for them. Because, there were some lessons learned. I did have those VAs who quit last minute or who didn't work out or had internet issues and all this stuff that I learned the hard way. And so we built Workogenics to solve that for other people. So that was how I got started with this. And it was so transformational. It allowed me to go from just being a solo agent where I had to work for every dollar I brought in to being able to have this team and having the team be a saleable asset that was paying me even once I wasn't actively working in it anymore because I was getting the money from the sale. So hope that was helpful. If you have any other questions or anything, drop them in the comments below and I'll be sure to check out and answer it. Or if this was helpful for you, whatever resonated, put it in there. And then join me again next week for another episode of The Freedom Blueprint.